Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, formerly Prince Andrew, is officially out of Royal Lodge. It's understood Andrew left under the cover of darkness, booted from his residence earlier than expected.
Andrew didn't arrive with headlines. He arrived with a smell. Thick, heavy, impossible to ignore, it spread across the fields before anyone noticed the trucks, the gates, or the quiet relocation taking shape. Then came the number. Over 150,000 gallons of liquid manure, dumped within days, right as everything else fell into place. Too precise to dismiss, too overwhelming to ignore. This didn't feel accidental. It felt arranged. So the question lingers, was this really just farming? Or something far more deliberate? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for what comes next. The smell that started everything. Andrew's arrival was not marked by headlines or visible movement, but by a smell that reached people before any explanation did. It moved across the fields and into nearby homes, settling in a way that felt unusual. At first, it was easy to dismiss as part of rural life, but it did not fade as expected. Instead, it remained, growing more noticeable with each passing day. Locals did not immediately connect it to any activity at Marsh Farm. The movement of trucks, the installation of gates, and the quiet preparation of the property all went largely unnoticed. What drew attention was the odor itself. It became the first clear sign that something had changed, even before anyone could explain what that change was. As people began to compare what they were experiencing, the pattern became harder to ignore. This was not a brief or isolated occurrence. The smell continued to return, holding its presence longer than expected. That persistence led to closer observation of the land behind the farmhouse, where the source gradually came into view. Tankers were moving in and out of the property in a steady sequence. At first, their presence did not seem unusual, but the repetition stood out over time. They arrived, unloaded, and left, only to be followed by more. This cycle continued over several days, creating a pattern that suggested coordination rather than routine activity. In total, more than 24 tankers passed through the site, each releasing large quantities of liquid manure into the surrounding fields. The scale of the operation was not immediately clear until the figures were considered. Around 150,000 gallons had been deposited within that short period, a volume that shifted the situation from ordinary farming into something that drew closer scrutiny. The timing added another layer to what people were observing. This was not an event from months earlier or part of a distant farming schedule. It was happening at the same time Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was moving into the farmhouse. The tankers were active as his belongings arrived, as new gates were installed, and as final preparations were completed. What had started as a smell led to a sequence of observations that raised further questions, not just about the scale of what was taking place, but about how closely it aligned with everything else happening at Marsh Farm. So, as all this unfolded around Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, was it a coincidence or coordination? Let's watch closely. Timing that feels too perfect. Andrew's move into Marsh Farm did not happen in isolation. It unfolded alongside a series of changes that appeared tightly aligned in both timing and execution. His arrival, the completion of renovations, the installation of security gates, and the large-scale manure operation all occurred within the same narrow window, making it difficult to separate one from the other. The farmhouse had already been prepared well before he stepped in. Builders had spent weeks repainting rooms, laying carpets, adjusting layouts, and refining the interior to fit its new purpose. This was not a rushed relocation into a ready-made space, but a controlled setup that suggested planning. By the time Andrew's belongings began to arrive, the property had already been reshaped to receive him. The gates came next, large wooden structures installed at the entrance with a clear focus on security rather than appearance. Their timing placed them at the final stage of preparation, arriving just as everything else was being completed. They did not feel like an upgrade added later, but part of the same sequence, reinforcing the sense that each step had been coordinated. At the same time, the manure operation that had first drawn attention was still unfolding. Over 150,000 gallons were spread across the land within days, saturating the surrounding fields. This did not happen months earlier as part of a routine cycle. It occurred alongside Andrew's move, matching the timeline of the final preparations and his arrival. The official explanation was direct and consistent. The estate had adopted organic farming practices focusing on sustainability, soil enrichment, and long-term environmental efficiency. Within that framework, the manure was presented as part of a working agricultural system, necessary for maintaining the land. On paper, the reasoning was clear and structured. However, once the timing was placed alongside the explanation, the situation became harder to separate into simple cause and effect. The scale of the operation, combined with its exact overlap with Andrew's relocation, shifted attention away from the farming itself and toward the sequence of events. What might have been accepted as routine under different circumstances began to invite closer scrutiny. At the same time, 3 removal vans from Gander and White arrived at the property. Known for transporting high-value items such as artwork and rare collections, their presence suggested that the move involved more than standard belongings. Items linked to Andrew's previous residence were being transferred carefully, handled with precision and discretion. This created a visible contrast. Inside, valuable possessions were being moved with care and control. Outside, the land was saturated with manure, and the smell continued to linger across the area. The two processes happened together, yet felt disconnected in nature, as though they belonged to entirely different environments. The shift in scale also became clearer at this point. Andrew was moving from Royal Lodge, a large and controlled residence, into a 5-bedroom farmhouse surrounded by active farmland. The setting was no longer defined by privacy and distance, but by ongoing agricultural activity that could not be paused or adjusted around him. As these elements aligned, the preparations, the arrival, the gates, the transport of belongings, and the manure operation, the focus moved away from individual events and toward their coordination. The explanation of organic farming remained in place, but the precision of the timing continued to draw attention, raising the question of whether this sequence had unfolded naturally or followed a more deliberate structure. But as everything aligned around Andrew, what exactly was being moved behind those gates? Stay with us. What was quietly brought in? The vans did not arrive with noise or urgency, yet their presence carried a weight that immediately shifted the tone of the entire move. They appeared without spectacle, moving through the gates with a level of control that stood in contrast to everything happening beyond the property. These were not ordinary relocation vehicles, and the name attached to them, Gander and White, made that distinction unmistakable. Known for transporting valuable artwork, rare collections, and historically significant pieces, their involvement suggested that what was being moved into Marsh Farm extended far beyond everyday belongings. What those vans carried was never publicly listed, yet the implications were clear enough to fuel speculation. Items once housed within Royal Lodge, objects tied to a life of scale and privilege, were now being transferred into a farmhouse setting that could not replicate the environment they came from. These were not just possessions. They were extensions of identity, fragments of a carefully maintained world that had operated within controlled boundaries for decades. Each crate, each handled piece, represented something that belonged to a different context entirely. The process itself reinforced that idea. Nothing appeared rushed or improvised. Movements were deliberate, measured, and executed with precision, as though every item required not only protection, but preservation of meaning. The handling reflected an awareness of value, not just in monetary terms, but in what those objects symbolized. This was a controlled transfer of history, taking place behind gates that limited visibility and reduced the entire operation to something only partially observed. Yet just outside that controlled space, a different reality remained impossible to ignore. The land surrounding Marsh Farm had already been saturated by the recent manure operation, and the air still carried its presence in a way that could not be filtered out or contained. The contrast was immediate and striking. Inside the property, valuable items were being handled with care and precision, maintaining a sense of order and refinement. Outside, the environment was defined by working farmland, agricultural cycles, and an odor that refused to dissipate. This contrast created a quiet but persistent tension between two worlds existing side by side. On one hand, there was an effort to preserve elements of a previous life, to bring continuity into a new setting, through the careful movement of significant possessions. On the other, there was a landscape that imposed its own conditions, one that did not adapt to those imported symbols of status, but instead remained grounded in its own function and rhythm. The result was not a seamless transition, but a visible clash between past and present. Beyond the gates, the reaction from the surrounding community added another layer to that tension. In nearby King's Lynn, the response was neither welcoming nor curious. It was marked by distance, skepticism, and in some cases, direct calls for accountability. The move did not erase what had come before. It followed him, shaping how the entire situation was perceived. The arrival of valuable possessions did not signal restoration or continuity to those watching from the outside. Instead, it reinforced the contrast between what was being preserved internally and what was being questioned externally. What made the situation even more striking was the absence of any direct narrative from within. There were no statements, no attempts to clarify or respond, and no visible effort to guide public perception. Everything unfolded behind the scenes, from the arrival of the vans to the placement of their contents, creating an environment where actions spoke without explanation. This silence did not reduce attention. It amplified it, allowing each detail to be examined more closely and interpreted more freely. When these elements are viewed together, the controlled arrival of high-value possessions, the stark contrast with the surrounding farmland, the cold reception from the public, and the persistent silence, the move begins to take on a different meaning. It no longer reads as a straightforward relocation, but as part of a broader shift, where the careful preservation of the past is placed within a setting that reflects a very different present. And within that contrast, the question becomes less about what was moved and more about what that movement represents. And with silence holding and meaning shifting, was Marsh Farm ever truly Andrew's choice, or something already decided? Keep watching. A home that wasn't chosen. Marsh Farm did not come together at the last minute, and nothing about it suggested urgency or improvisation. Long before arrival became visible, the property had already been reshaped through deliberate preparation, as if it had been waiting to receive a very specific occupant. Renovations were not limited to surface-level adjustments. They extended into the structure itself, with interiors repainted, rooms reconfigured, and layouts subtly altered to accommodate a different way of living. Carpets were laid, spaces were refined, and the environment was brought into a condition that felt complete rather than transitional. This level of preparation created an impression that went beyond readiness. It suggested an intention. The farmhouse did not feel like a temporary solution or a quiet fallback. It felt finalized, as though every detail had been settled in advance. That impression was reinforced by the installation of large wooden gates at the entrance, not designed to enhance appearance, but to establish control. Their structure was firm, their purpose clear, and their placement signaled a boundary that was meant to hold. These were not the kind of features associated with short-term residence. They marked permanence. Yet, the most significant aspect of Marsh Farm was not contained within its walls. The land itself had transformed years earlier, evolving into a fully operational organic farming system built around sustainability. On paper, it reflected modern agricultural principles, with cattle, crops, and natural fertilization working together in a structured cycle. However, the scale of that system shifted its meaning in practice. With approximately 500 cattle generating continuous output and long-term plans already approved for a slurry lagoon the size of 3 Olympic swimming pools, this was not a quiet rural setting, but an industrial-level operation. Placing someone within that environment carried implications that extended beyond geography. The farmland did not adapt to its occupant. It operated on its own schedule, driven by cycles that did not pause or adjust. Tractors moved when required, tankers returned as part of routine, and the conditions created by that system remained constant. What had been described officially as sustainable practice was experienced locally as something far more intrusive, a presence that crossed boundaries and settled into daily life without restraint. For someone accustomed to highly controlled surroundings, where space, privacy, and environment could be managed with precision, this shift represented more than relocation. The contrast between Royal Lodge and Marsh Farm was not simply a matter of size or appearance. Royal Lodge had existed as a contained world, expansive and insulated, where external factors rarely disrupted internal conditions. Marsh Farm, by comparison, was exposed, functional, and inseparably connected to the land that defined it. Inside the renovated farmhouse, those limits became visible in quieter ways. Rooms, despite being refreshed, could not expand to accommodate everything that once belonged. Walls imposed boundaries that required decisions, not preferences. Spaces that had once allowed for accumulation now demanded reduction, leaving behind visible absences where items could not follow. The environment shaped behavior, forcing adjustments that could not be avoided or reversed. This combination of internal constraint and external exposure created a setting that did not feel chosen in the traditional sense. It felt assigned. The preparation, the timing, and the surrounding conditions all pointed toward a controlled repositioning, where the outcome had been structured in advance and the role within it had already been defined. The farmhouse did not simply house its occupant. It imposed a framework that could not be expanded beyond its limits. And beyond the walls, the land continued its cycle, indifferent to status or past position. Each passing tanker, each treated field, and each returning wave of odor reinforced the same quiet message, one that did not require explanation to be understood. So, as those limits closed in around Andrew, what did that really mean for the life he once controlled? Stay with us. A reduced life. Royal Lodge represented more than size. It represented a way of living built around space, control, and quiet expansion. Rooms were not simply functional. They allowed for accumulation, for habits to exist without restriction, for collections to grow without consequence. The environment supported continuity, where nothing needed to be removed to make room for something new. That sense of scale created a rhythm of life that felt stable, predictable, and firmly within control. Marsh Farm operates under a very different logic, one defined not by expansion but by limitation. The shift from a 30-room residence to a 5-bedroom farmhouse is not just a numerical reduction. It introduces a completely different set of constraints that cannot be negotiated or avoided. Space is no longer flexible, and every room carries a boundary that must be respected. What once existed without question now requires evaluation, and what once remained untouched must now be reconsidered. This is where the pressure of downsizing begins to take shape, not as a single moment, but as an ongoing process of forced decisions. Every item brought from the previous residence must justify its place within a smaller framework, and not everything can be justified. Choices are no longer about preference but necessity, and each decision leaves a trace of what has been left behind. The process does not end once the move is complete. It continues as the reality of limited space becomes fully apparent. The most revealing detail of this transition is found in something seemingly small, yet deeply symbolic: a collection of 72 teddy bears, once arranged with precision and familiarity, is reduced to a single piece making the move. The number itself carries weight, not because of the objects, but because of what their reduction represents. It reflects a shift from abundance to selection, from continuity to interruption. What was once preserved in full must now be condensed, edited, and in many ways, abandoned. This reduction extends beyond physical possessions into something more personal. The environment at Royal Lodge allowed for a certain identity to be maintained without challenge, where surroundings reinforced a sense of position and control. Marsh Farm does not offer the same reinforcement. Instead, it introduces conditions that reshape how space is experienced and how daily life unfolds. Comfort is no longer automatic, and the absence of familiar structures becomes more noticeable over time. Control, which once existed as a constant, becomes fragmented. Decisions that were once optional become unavoidable, and the ability to maintain a preferred environment is replaced by the need to adapt to what is available. This shift is not always visible from the outside, but it manifests in the way space is used, in what remains present, and in what is no longer there. The gaps left behind by removed possessions are not just physical. They reflect adjustments that extend into routine and perception. What makes this transition particularly striking is that it does not present itself as a temporary inconvenience. The limitations are built into the structure of the farmhouse itself, meaning that the adjustments required are not short-term accommodations, but ongoing conditions. There is no immediate path back to what existed before, and no clear way to recreate that previous environment within the current setting. In this way, the move becomes more than a change of location. It becomes a process of reduction that touches both the tangible and the intangible, where space, possessions, and identity are all reshaped by the same constraints. The difference between Royal Lodge and Marsh Farm is not simply one of size, but one of what can be sustained, what must be left behind, and what can no longer be controlled. But as control slipped from Andrew's hands, what reality was he now forced to live with? Let's find out. The reality. He can't escape. Routine changed first, and it changed in ways that could not be adjusted back. What had once been handled quietly in the background by a full household staff now surfaced as visible gaps in daily life, where services that were once immediate became occasional, and assistance that had been constant became limited. Tasks that required no thought before now required attention, coordination, and patience, creating a shift that extended beyond convenience into something more structural. The absence of that support system did not simply reduce comfort, it altered the rhythm of living itself. This shift introduced a different kind of pressure, one that did not announce itself loudly, but remained present in every small disruption. Control, which had previously been embedded in the environment, began to dissolve into a series of adjustments that could not be fully managed. Instead of shaping the surroundings to fit personal preference, there was now a need to adapt to conditions that operated independently. The balance moved from command to accommodation, and that transition carried a psychological weight that could not be easily dismissed. Beyond the walls of the farmhouse, the environment reinforced that shift with constant clarity. The land surrounding Marsh Farm functioned as a working system driven by agricultural cycles that continued without interruption. With approximately 500 cattle contributing to the ongoing process, the scale of activity extended far beyond what could be considered a quiet rural setting. This was not a landscape that paused or softened. It maintained its pace regardless of who occupied the space within it. The result was an environment defined by repetition and continuity. Tankers moved through the land as part of routine operations, fields were treated in cycles that followed agricultural demands, and the byproducts of that system remained present in a way that could not be ignored. The smell that had first drawn attention did not fade into the background as a temporary disturbance. It settled into the atmosphere as a recurring presence, returning with each cycle and reinforcing its place within the environment. What had initially been perceived as an external condition gradually became integrated into daily experience. It was no longer something that could be avoided by closing a window or stepping indoors. Instead, it existed as part of the setting itself, crossing boundaries and remaining consistent in a way that made it unavoidable. For someone accustomed to filtered air, controlled surroundings, and carefully maintained privacy, this represented a shift that extended beyond discomfort into a constant reminder of change. The contrast between past and present was not limited to visible differences in space or structure. It was embedded in the sensory experience of the environment. Royal Lodge had existed as a contained world where external influences were minimized, allowing for a degree of separation from surrounding conditions. Marsh Farm operates differently, with the land and its functions directly shaping the atmosphere in ways that cannot be isolated or reduced. This creates a setting where the environment does not simply surround its occupant, but defines the terms of daily life. Each passing tanker, each treated field, and each return of the odor reinforces a condition that cannot be negotiated or altered. The cycles continue, the system remains active, and the presence of that activity becomes a steady backdrop that does not recede. Over time, this consistency transforms the environment into something more than a physical location. It becomes a continuous point of reference, a reminder that the conditions of the present are fixed within a structure that does not bend to individual preference. The shift from control to restriction is no longer abstract. It is experienced in the air, in the routines, and in the limits that shape each day. In this way, the reality of Marsh Farm extends beyond its visible features, embedding itself into daily life as something that cannot be escaped or ignored, but must instead be endured as part of an environment that defines its own terms. While Marsh Farm's reality settles in, how does King's Lynn respond to Andrew now? Let's watch closely. Silence, judgment, and the bigger shift. King's Lynn did not respond with curiosity or quiet acceptance. It responded with distance that felt deliberate and at times openly critical. Conversations within the area did not revolve around fascination with a royal relocation, but around accountability, consequence, and the unresolved weight of what had come before. Some residents remained indifferent, choosing distance over engagement, while others were far more direct in their expectations, making it clear that the move had not reset public perception in any meaningful way. What made that reaction more significant was the absence of any response from within. There were no statements offered to reshape the narrative, no public appearances to soften the tone, and no visible effort to address the growing tension. The silence did not exist as a neutral gap. It expanded, filling the space where explanation might have been, and in doing so, it intensified the scrutiny surrounding every visible detail. Each development, from the movement of vehicles to the transformation of the property, unfolded without commentary, leaving observers to interpret events without guidance. When these elements are placed side by side, the structure of the situation becomes more defined. The timing of the move, aligned so closely with the large-scale manure operation, created an overlap that drew attention. The scale of that operation, measured in thousands of gallons and supported by an ongoing agricultural system, added weight that could not be dismissed as minor or incidental. The setting, shaped by working farmland and constant activity, reinforced a shift away from controlled environments towards something far more exposed. And through all of it, the silence remained, allowing each piece to stand without explanation. This combination does not present itself as a simple change of residence. It reads as something more structured, where multiple factors converge in a way that suggests coordination rather than coincidence. The move does not feel like a reset or a fresh start. It carries the tone of adjustment, of repositioning within a framework that has already been defined. What remains is not a conclusion, but a tension that continues to build, shaped by what has been seen, what has not been said, and what each detail appears to suggest when viewed as part of a larger pattern. So what do you think? Was Andrew's move to Marsh Farm a simple relocation, or a carefully structured repositioning shaped by silence and scrutiny? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.